ladies and gentlemen. What is it that we are running from, that we seek to avoid, that haunts the quiet spaces of our minds? It is not an external enemy, nor some mythical beast waiting to devour us. The demons we fear are born within, from the very depths of our minds. They are not separate from us, they are the shadows of our thoughts, the hidden parts of ourselves that we are reluctant to face. The mind is a vast expanse, a landscape constantly shifting between clarity and confusion. Our demons appear when the mind is caught in its habitual patterns of fear, of shame, of desire. These patterns create the illusion of a fixed self, a self that must be defended and protected. But this self is not a fortress, it is fluid, changing moment by moment. And so, when we face our demons, we confront not a rigid identity, but a shifting, ever-evolving process. The truth is, we all have a shadow, a part of ourselves that we have repressed, denied, or ignored. Perhaps it's an old wound, an unspoken fear, a longing we dare not express. But here is the paradox: by embracing the shadow, we no longer remain enslaved to it. We take away its power not by fighting it, but by acknowledging it and accepting it as part of our totality. Awareness is the key. It is the light that dispels the darkness. Our demons thrive in the unconscious, fed by our refusal to examine them. But when we bring them into conscious awareness, they lose their grip on us. They are no longer ghosts lurking in the shadows. They are simply thoughts that we can choose to release, to let go of, or to transform. Fear is another aspect of our demons, and we must learn to welcome it. Fear is not an enemy to defeat. It is simply the mind's response to the unknown. We do not need to eliminate fear. Rather, we must learn to move through it, understanding that it is simply a passing wave in the ocean of our experience. When we face our demons, we transform fear into wisdom. We see that it is not a force to resist, but an invitation to expand, to understand, to grow. True freedom comes not from trying to fix ourselves, to improve ourselves endlessly. No, true freedom arises from accepting ourselves as we are. Facing your demons is an act of radical self-acceptance. It is acknowledging that everything you are, your fears, your desires, your wounds, is a part of the whole. In this acceptance, you find the peace you have been seeking. In the present moment, there are no demons. There is only what is. Our demons are not real. They are stories we tell ourselves, projections of past regrets or future anxieties. When we let go of the attachment to time, we see that the demons are illusions. They dissolve in the present moment, where only life exists, untouched by the past and untainted by the future. The truth is, we are all interconnected. Light and dark, joy and sorrow, they are not opposites to be fought against. They are two sides of the same coin, inseparable, part of the same dance of existence. When we face our demons, we are not separating ourselves from them, but embracing them as part of the whole. In this embrace, they lose their power over us. To face your demons is to let go, to release your grip on the fear, the anger, the regret that has bound you. Holding on to these emotions is like clutching a burning coal, thinking that it will harm another. But in the end, it only burns you. Letting go is freedom, freedom to experience life as it is, without the weight of unnecessary burdens. And in facing your demons, you reclaim your power. For your demons only have power over you when you give them your energy. When you recognize them for what they are, fleeting thoughts, transient emotions, you take back the energy you had surrendered. No longer do you fight against them. You integrate them, and in doing so, you transform. The process of transformation is a paradox. We cannot force it. It comes not through struggle, but through surrender. It is the natural unfolding of life. When we stop trying to change, we change, we change. When we face our demons without resistance, they dissolve and we are free. So I invite you today to face your demons not as enemies to be defeated, but as teachers to be embraced. They are not outside you, but within. In facing them, you face yourself. And in that moment, you will find not only peace, but a deep, transformative freedom. The mind is often compared to a vast, ever-changing landscape, one that fluctuates between moments of clarity and chaos, peace and turmoil. It is the arena in which all our thoughts, emotions, and experiences unfold. Yet, despite its dynamic nature, we tend to treat the mind as something static, as if it should remain a stable and predictable entity. We imagine that we should have control over it, that it should be dominated by a singular, consistent identity. However, the truth is that the mind is not something we can control in the way we often wish. It is a fluid, living thing, constantly shifting, reorganizing itself, and presenting new patterns at every turn. The nature of the mind is not one of permanence, but of change, ebbing and flowing like the tide. We are, in essence, not separate from this flow, but part of it. Our minds are deeply influenced by everything we encounter, the sights, sounds, and emotions that fill our day, the stories we tell ourselves, the experiences that shape us. Each thought that arises in our consciousness is not an isolated event, but part of an ongoing process, a cascade of reactions and memories linked by invisible threads. And yet, in our attempt to understand and make sense of these fluctuations, we often forget that they are not separate from us. We identify with them, clinging to them, believing that these thoughts define who we are. In doing so, we are caught in an illusion, a belief that the mind is a singular, fixed entity when it is, in fact, a fluid, constantly evolving landscape. The mind is not an enemy to be conquered, nor a fortress that can be defended. It is not something that can be contained or controlled indefinitely. Just as the sky shifts from clear to stormy, so too does the mind shift between moments of tranquility and chaos. To truly understand the nature of the mind, one must stop fighting this natural process. The more we attempt to control or suppress it, the more we contribute to the very turmoil we seek to avoid. Rather than struggling against it, we must learn to observe it, watching how thoughts arise and fall away, noticing their patterns without judgment. This awareness is the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of the mind's true nature. In our daily lives, we become so absorbed in our thoughts and emotions that we often forget that the mind itself is not the problem, it is our relationship with it. The demons we often speak of, the fears, the doubts, the regrets, are not external forces, but aspects of our own mental landscape. They are the manifestations of our attachments, the unexamined thoughts that lurk in the unconscious. These mental patterns shape our perception of reality, and in doing so, they influence how we respond to the world. But they are not us. They are not fixed truths, they are transient, impermanent. The more we cling to them, the more power they have over us. But when we step back and observe them without attachment, we begin to see that they are not as solid as we once believed. The mind's true nature is not one of control or resistance, but of flow and transformation. Just as a river carves its path through the land, our thoughts, emotions, and experiences carve their way through the mind. But just as the river constantly changes course, so too does the mind. It is in this fluidity that we find freedom, not in an attempt to shape the mind into something static, but in learning to flow with it, to move with its currents rather than against them. To face our demons is to recognize that they are not permanent fixtures within the mind. They are passing clouds in an ever-changing sky. The key to understanding the mind is not to treat it as something separate from ourselves, something we must control or conquer. Instead, it is to recognize that the mind is an integral part of our being, an ever-changing process, not a static object. When we stop resisting the flow of thought, when we stop clinging to the transient patterns that arise, we open ourselves to the deeper currents of awareness that lie beneath. In this space of awareness, we realize that the mind is not something to be conquered, but something to be understood, to be experienced fully in its fluid, changing nature. It is only through this understanding that we can truly face our demons, by recognizing them as part of the very nature of the mind, not as external enemies, but as fleeting thoughts that, like all things, will pass. The concept of the self is one of the most pervasive illusions in human consciousness. It is a belief that we hold dearly, shaping not only our perception of who we are, but also how we engage with the world around us. We live with the constant notion that there is a stable, fixed entity and unchanging self that exists independent of time and circumstance. This self is the center from which we experience life, and it is often seen as the source of our identity, our desires, and our actions. But when we look closely at this idea, we begin to realize that this self, which we have so tightly clung to, may not be as real or solid as we think. At the core of this illusion is the mind's tendency to identify with thoughts, memories, and experiences. We define ourselves by the narratives we create about our past, present, and future. From a young age, we are taught to view ourselves as distinct, separate beings with unique attributes and characteristics. This sense of separateness is reinforced by the language we use. Pronouns like I, me, and my create a constant reaffirmation of a singular, individual identity. We are led to believe that the I we speak of is a permanent and independent entity, something that exists in isolation from everything else. However, when we look deeply into the nature of the mind, we begin to see that this sense of a fixed self is actually an accumulation of experiences, thoughts, and emotions that are constantly in flux. There is no single, unchanging I that persists across time. The I that we identify with today is not the same I we were yesterday, nor will it be the same tomorrow. We change constantly physically, emotionally, and mentally, yet we continue to cling to the idea of a permanent self. In reality, the self is not something solid and fixed, but something fluid, constantly evolving, and even fragmented. The more we cling to this illusion of a permanent self, the more we create suffering for ourselves. We attach ourselves to identities, roles, labels, and definitions that give us a sense of security and control. We build our lives around these identities: the successful person, the loving parent, the diligent worker, the creative individual. These identities become the lens through which we view the world, and we begin to define ourselves by them. When these identities are threatened, when we lose our job, when we face failure, or when we experience loss, we are faced with the collapse of the illusion that the self is something stable. It is in these moments of crisis that the illusion becomes most apparent. The sense of loss we feel is not merely about the external event, but about the threat to the self that we have spent our lives constructing. When we start to question the nature of this self, we begin to see that it is a construct of the mind, a collection of stories we tell ourselves. These stories are not necessarily true, they are simply patterns of thought and perception that we have come to believe. The self is not a static entity, but a dynamic process. It is not something we possess, but something we experience. This realization can be both liberating and unsettling. If the self is not fixed, if it is not the unchanging entity we once thought it to be, then who are we really? In truth, the self is not separate from the world around us. We are not isolated beings, but part of an interconnected whole. The illusion of separateness arises when we fail to see that our thoughts, emotions, and experiences are intimately connected to everything else in the universe. Our sense of I is in fact a reflection of the world we inhabit, shaped by the relationships we form, the culture we belong to, and the environments we live in. The self is not a singular, isolated being, but a vast interconnected network of experiences, perceptions, and relationships. When we let go of the illusion of the self, we begin to experience life in a radically different way. We stop seeing ourselves as separate from the world, and we start to understand that we are part of an ever-changing, interconnected process. The boundaries between the self and the other begin to dissolve, and we experience a deeper sense of unity with the world around us. In this state, we are not burdened by the need to protect or defend a fixed self. Instead, we can embrace life as it is, free from the constraints of identity and attachment. The illusion of the self is a powerful force, one that shapes much of our experience. But when we begin to see through this illusion, we realize that the self is not something we can hold on to or control. It is a passing moment, a fleeting thought, an ever-changing process that flows with the tides of life. When we stop identifying with this illusion, we open ourselves to the vastness of life itself, a life without the rigid boundaries of the self, a life where we can simply be, without the weight of self-judgment or the need for defense. In this freedom, we discover a profound sense of peace. To embrace the shadow is to confront the parts of ourselves that we have long denied, rejected, or feared. The shadow represents all that we have pushed into the depths of our unconscious, those aspects of our being that we deem undesirable, unworthy, or even dangerous. It is not some foreign entity outside of us, but rather a collection of traits, desires, and emotions that we have cast aside in the pursuit of a cleaner, more acceptable identity. Yet, despite our efforts to bury these parts, they persist, influencing our thoughts, actions, and experiences in ways we often do not recognize. To truly embrace the shadow is to acknowledge that these hidden aspects are not separate from who we are, they are an integral part of our humanity. From an early age, we are taught to distinguish between what is good and what is bad, what is acceptable and what is not. We learn to behave in ways that align with social norms, moral expectations, and familial standards. The parts of ourselves that do not fit into these categories, those impulses, desires, and thoughts that feel uncomfortable or transgressive, are pushed away and buried in the unconscious. We may suppress anger because it is considered socially unacceptable, or we may hide our vulnerabilities for fear of appearing weak. Over time, these rejected parts form a shadow, a collection of our unacknowledged traits and feelings. The problem, however, is that this rejection does not make the shadow disappear. It simply forces it into the unconscious, where it continues to shape our lives in subtle and not so subtle ways. The more we resist the shadow, the more power we give it. When we fail to acknowledge and integrate these parts of ourselves, they often manifest in destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors. The anger we have suppressed might emerge in a moment of rage, or our feelings of inadequacy may surface as anxiety. The shadow is not something that can be banished or avoided. It is a part of us that must be acknowledged if we are to live authentically. Embracing the shadow requires us to look at ourselves honestly and without judgment. It asks us to step beyond the comfortable narratives we have constructed about who we are and to confront the full complexity of our being. It is an act of radical self-acceptance. We must come to terms with the fact that we are not simply good or pure or virtuous, but rather a mix of light and dark, strengths and weaknesses, virtues and vices. To embrace the shadow is to acknowledge that we are all, at times, petty, selfish, angry, or fearful, and that these qualities are not inherent flaws, but simply part of the human experience. In embracing the shadow, we also begin to see that it is not the bad parts of ourselves that cause suffering, but rather our refusal to accept them. The more we resist the shadow, the more we allow it to control us from the depths of the unconscious. But when we bring these parts into the light, when we allow ourselves to feel our anger, to experience our jealousy, to acknowledge our insecurities, we begin to neutralize their power. The shadow loses its grip on us when we stop fearing it, when we stop treating it as an enemy. In fact, it is through embracing the shadow that we find the potential for growth and transformation. These denied parts, when integrated, can become sources of strength, wisdom, and authenticity. Integrating the shadow does not mean indulging in negative traits or acting out destructive behaviors. It means recognizing the underlying emotions, desires, and fears that fuel these behaviors. By acknowledging our vulnerabilities, we create the space for self-compassion, and in doing so, we develop a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. The shadow also reveals parts of our creativity and power that have been locked away. For example, the suppressed anger we once feared can fuel assertiveness and self-advocacy when expressed in a healthy way. The buried jealousy may reveal a longing for deeper connection or the drive to improve our own lives. In this way, embracing the shadow leads not to destruction, but to a more integrated whole self. To embrace the shadow is to accept that we are multifaceted beings, each of us a combination of light and dark, strength and vulnerability. It is a recognition that no part of us is inherently bad or unworthy of love. The more we resist the shadow, the more we suffer under its influence. But when we accept it, when we stop pretending it does not exist, we unlock the power to transform our lives. Embracing the shadow is not an easy task, for it requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Yet in this confrontation, we find the freedom to live fully, authentically, and with a deeper sense of peace. It is through embracing the shadow that we ultimately find wholeness, a complete acceptance of who we are in all our complexity. Awareness is the key to unlocking the true nature of our minds and experiences. It is often said that we are not our thoughts, yet we live much of our lives as though we are consumed by them. The mind churns with a constant flow of thoughts, emotions, and reactions, most of which we experience on autopilot, without much reflection. Awareness, however, gives us the ability to step back from this continuous stream of mental activity and observe it from a place of detached clarity. This is where the power lies, not in controlling our thoughts, but in recognizing them for what they are: fleeting, temporary phenomena that do not define us. The human experience is largely shaped by the mind's tendency to create stories, often in response to external stimuli or internal emotional states. We create narratives about who we are, what we want, and what we fear. These stories shape our perception of reality, but most of the time we don't even realize that we are living in these stories. Awareness is the ability to notice these narratives as they arise, to see them for what they are, and to understand that they do not hold the absolute truth. When we become aware of our thoughts, we gain the ability to question them. Are they based on fact? Are they a product of fear or desire? Are they rooted in the past, or do they reflect the present moment? This kind of awareness transforms our relationship with ourselves and the world. Instead of being swept away by the current of thoughts, we become the observer, the one who stands outside the stream, watching it without judgment. In this space of observation, we realize that the mind is not something to control, but something to understand. The mind, with all its fluctuations, is simply a tool, a lens through which we experience life. It is not the ultimate reality, but a limited perspective that often distorts the truth. Through awareness, we can also see how deeply our emotions are tied to our thoughts. Emotions are not random or separate from our thoughts. They arise in response to the mental stories we tell ourselves. When we are not aware, we react to emotions impulsively, allowing them to control our behavior and decisions. Awareness gives us the ability to pause, to feel the emotion, and to explore its root cause without being driven by it. It is in this space of awareness that we find true freedom from the emotional patterns that tend to govern us. Awareness also allows us to live more fully in the present moment. The mind often drifts between the past and the future, caught up in regret or anticipation. The present moment, however, is where life is happening, and it is the only moment over which we have any control. When we are fully aware, we are not lost in memories or fantasies, but engaged with life as it unfolds before us. This brings a sense of peace and clarity, as we are no longer bogged down by the weight of past mistakes or the anxiety of future uncertainties. We become more attuned to the beauty and richness of each moment, and in that attention we find profound stillness. In this sense, awareness is not just about observing the mind, but about connecting to the deeper layers of experience that lie beneath the surface. It is about realizing that there is more to life than what the mind can capture. There is an underlying awareness that is always present, always observing, always in touch with the essence of who we are. It is through this deeper awareness that we begin to access a sense of peace and equanimity, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances or external events, but is rooted in the clarity of knowing ourselves as we truly are. In a world that is often chaotic, noisy, and overwhelming, awareness offers a sanctuary, a space of calm and insight where we can reconnect with our true selves. The power of awareness lies in its ability to free us from the grip of our thoughts and emotions, to allow us to experience life more fully and authentically. By cultivating awareness, we step out of the illusion that we are at the mercy of our minds and instead realize that we have the power to observe, to understand, and ultimately to transform the way we experience the world. Life and death are not opposing forces, but two sides of the same coin, inextricably linked in the grand rhythm of existence. They are the dance partners in a cosmic ballet, moving together in a seamless flow, each giving meaning to the other. We tend to view life and death as separate, as if life is the ultimate goal and death the inevitable end. Yet when we shift our perspective, we begin to understand that the beauty of life is not separate from the inevitability of death, but woven into its very fabric. They exist not as opposing forces, but as a continuous, ever-changing cycle that defines the essence of all things. From the moment we are born, we are already on the path to death. This truth, often ignored or feared, is at the heart of the human experience. Life and death are intimately connected, as one cannot exist without the other. Just as the rising sun gives way to the setting sun, every moment of life is an unfolding towards death. But this should not be seen as something bleak or tragic. Rather, it is through the awareness of our mortality that we are able to fully appreciate the fleeting, precious nature of life itself. If life were eternal, it would lose its urgency, its vibrancy, its drive. Death, in this sense, gives life its meaning. In every breath we take, we are participating in this dance. The inhalation is a moment of life, the exhalation a surrender to death. With each heartbeat, we are reminded that life is not permanent, that everything is in a state of constant flux. We hold on to life with such desperation, trying to freeze it in time, preserve it, control it. Yet, the more we cling to it, the more we miss the point. Life is not something to be held on to, it is something to be experienced, to be lived fully in the moment. And in that living, we must learn to embrace the impermanence, to accept that death is not a threat, but an inevitable part of the cycle. Thanks for watching.